3:27 p.m. In a courtroom filled with tension and silence thick enough to feel, a 13-year-old black boy stood at the edge of his fate. His name was Darius Collins. Every eye in the room was on the judge, who was seconds away from delivering a sentence that would alter Darius's life forever. But just before the gavel came down, Darius said two words that changed everything. This is not just another courtroom story. It is a reminder that in the face of injustice, even the smallest voice can carry the loudest truth. And sometimes, the most powerful disruption comes not from rage, but from honesty delivered at the perfect moment. Darius Collins had already been through more than most kids his age, targeted by a flawed justice system, misrepresented by his court-appointed attorney, and overshadowed by adults who had failed to see his humanity. He had learned to stay quiet to survive. But this time, silence would cost him everything. As Judge Raymond Ellis raised his gavel, the courtroom held its breath. Prosecutors smirked, certain their work was done. Darius's public defender avoided eye contact, his file barely open. The room was a breath away from sealing a future based on assumption and appearance. Then it happened. Darius raised his head, his voice quiet but firm. That was the moment Darius rewrote his fate, not with shouting or spectacle, but with the truth. This is the story of how those two words opened the door to buried evidence, exposed courtroom bias, and unleashed a national conversation about race, silence, and justice. Comment: truth has power if you're ready to witness how one boy's voice shook the system. Because Darius Collins didn't just save himself, he reminded all of us what happens when truth refuses to be ignored. Darius Collins was 13 years old and from the east side of Detroit. A quiet, artistic kid, he spent most of his free time sketching sneakers in his notebook, reading graphic novels at the library, and looking after his younger sister, Maya. He was the kind of kid who remembered birthdays, helped carry groceries for neighbors, and walked his sister home from school every day. But all it took was one moment, one wrong place at the wrong time, to label him something else entirely. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Darius was walking home with Maya when they passed a convenience store. Minutes earlier, it had been robbed. The suspect had already run. No weapon had been recovered, and no stolen items were found. But Darius, tall for his age, wearing a hoodie, and with skin deemed suspicious by the responding officers, was all they needed. The squad car pulled up with urgency. Officers jumped out and barked commands. Darius barely had time to speak. "He didn't do anything. He was with me," Maya cried from the sidewalk, clutching his sketch pad that had fallen during the scuffle. One of the officers, expression blank, shoved Darius into the back seat. "Tell it to the judge," the officer muttered, slamming the door behind him. Inside the precinct, Darius was questioned without a lawyer present. No guardian, no advocate, just questions stacked with assumptions and silence in place of support. He tried to explain, but every word felt like it sank into a void. His hoodie became a threat. His quiet nature became evasive. His sketches, found in his backpack, were flipped through like evidence. No fingerprints on the scene, no security footage, no stolen property recovered. But Darius was processed anyway. The report was filed, and the story was already taking shape. A young black boy near the scene of a crime. It did not matter that he had no record. It did not matter that his sister swore he was with her the entire time. In the days that followed, his school fell silent. Teachers avoided eye contact. Friends disappeared. The weight of assumption pressed in. Even those who once praised his drawings now looked through him as if he were invisible. all because of how he looked, where he stood, and who the system thought he must be. Comment: if this hit home. Because no child should be judged before they speak, and no innocence should be erased without evidence. Judge Ronald Marks, infamous for his stern demeanor and a long record of disproportionately harsh rulings against black youth, leaned forward at the bench. His glare bore down on Darius Collins like a weight. "We don't have time for games," Judge Marks said, his voice dry and dismissive. "You were there. You fit the description. Guilty." Darius stood in the witness box, his hands trembling, eyes darting to the rows of strangers watching. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. His lawyer sat silent, offering no help. The prosecutor looked smug, certain this was an open and shut case. The judge raised his gavel. Then it happened. Darius took a step forward and shouted, voice cracking but strong, "Judge, listen to me. What happened was—" The room froze. Even the gavel paused midair. Darius's breath came fast. He clutched something small and worn in his hand. "I was chasing my sister's sketchbook. It flew into the alley when the wind blew. That's where the guy ran past me. I wasn't stealing anything. I was running after her drawings." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small notebook, the edges frayed, the pages dog-eared from use. "See, these are hers. That's all I had. Not a wallet, not a phone, just her drawings." He opened the notebook and held it up. The pages fluttered, revealing colorful sketches of cartoon characters, superheroes, and sneakers, all signed Maya in small, neat handwriting. Gasps and murmurs filled the courtroom. The defense attorney leaned forward, stunned. The prosecutor narrowed his eyes, suddenly uncertain. The judge stared at the notebook, his gavel still suspended. "These are the drawings the officers reported?" Judge Marks asked. Darius nodded. "They didn't ask. They just grabbed me." For the first time, the courtroom saw something different. Not a suspect, but a brother trying to protect his sister's art. A boy with truth in his voice and nothing in his hands but paper and pencil. A long silence followed. Then the judge slowly lowered the gavel. Comment: let him speak. If you believe every child deserves to be heard in court. Because sometimes the truth is hidden not in evidence, but in what no one bothered to ask. It started with a sketch. In the back row of the courtroom, a local courtroom artist named Lynn Moreno had been silently capturing the scene. She was there on assignment, expected to deliver visual impressions of the day's events. But when Darius Collins stood and cried out, "Judge, listen to me," something in her shifted. She quickly sketched his tear-streaked face, his hand holding the worn notebook, and the moment the courtroom froze. That evening, Lynn posted the drawing on Instagram, captioned with the words that had echoed through the court, "Judge, listen to me." Within hours, the image caught fire. TikTok picked it up. Twitter threads exploded. Instagram reels featured the clip of Darius's voice in the sketch, played over music and text that read, "He just wanted to be heard." The hashtag #Justice for Darius began trending globally. Influential voices joined in. Civil rights attorneys retweeted the post with commentary about the importance of child testimony. Celebrities posted the sketch alongside quotes like, "Children aren't statistics, they're stories." Public figures used the moment to call for deeper accountability in the justice system. By morning, major news outlets were covering it. Headlines read, "13-year-old interrupts sentencing with truth that shocks courtroom." Sketch goes viral. Child's words spark legal firestorm. Audio clips from the trial aired on television. Talk show hosts played the footage and invited Darius's mother and sister to appear, letting the world hear from the people behind the story. Petitions demanding an investigation into Judge Ronald Marks gained traction. One surpassed 1 million signatures in under 48 hours. Legal oversight boards began reviewing his previous cases for signs of racial bias. The courthouse that once felt like a cage now became a beacon of national attention. More importantly, Darius's words became a symbol. His voice, once ignored, was now amplified. His plea, once dismissed, was now on banners, on stages, and in classrooms across the country. Comment: thumbs up. If you believe no child should be sentenced without being truly heard. Because sometimes 2 words can wake up an entire system. The courtroom lights buzzed overhead as the case against Darius Collins took a dramatic turn. The viral attention and mounting public pressure had forced the court to halt proceedings for an emergency review. What came next would flip the narrative on its head. A local journalist, digging through city footage after Darius's story exploded online, uncovered a new angle from a nearby security camera. The grainy video showed a figure fleeing the scene, not Darius, but a taller man in dark jeans and a gray hoodie. He was running in the opposite direction of where Darius had been picked up. The footage clearly showed the suspect ducking into an alley, while Darius appeared seconds later, coming from a completely different direction, clutching his sister's sketchbook. He had not even looked back. His body language spoke not of guilt, but panic. When this evidence was presented, the courtroom shifted. Whispers filled the gallery. The judge asked for silence. More details emerged. The actual suspect? Already known to law enforcement, he had a record. He matched the original witness description exactly. But for reasons no one could explain, he had never been pursued. The arresting officers admitted they had not even reviewed external footage before booking Darius. Judge Ronald Marks tried to push back. This is circumstantial at best. We cannot derail a court process based on viral influence. But this time, Darius was not alone. His public defender, until now quiet and overwhelmed, stepped forward with unshakable resolve. "Your Honor," he said clearly, locking eyes with the bench, "this child has been failed once. He won't be failed again." A heavy pause followed. The room held its breath as Judge Marks looked from the attorney to Darius. The boy's sketchbook lay on the table in front of him, still open to a page of hand-drawn sneakers and cartoons. With a reluctant sigh, the judge picked up his gavel. Charges dismissed. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom. A wave of emotion surged across the room. Darius's sister cried out softly. His mother covered her face in relief. Reporters dashed for the exits, ready to file the update. And Darius, he stood still, stunned, free. Comment: he's free if you felt that gavel drop deep in your soul. Because justice may come late, but it comes louder when the truth finally speaks. Darius Collins walked out of the courthouse with the world watching, but in that moment, all he saw was his little sister running straight into his arms. She clung to him as if she would never let go again. For the first time in weeks, Darius felt the sun on his face without the shadow of judgment. He was free. But Darius knew freedom meant more than walking out of a courtroom. It meant using his voice to make sure no one else had to stand where he did, scared and unheard. With the help of local youth justice organizations, Darius began channeling his experience into action. He collaborated with nonprofits focused on legal advocacy for minors, joining panels in youth circles where he spoke about what it meant to be accused without evidence, without fairness, without a voice. It was not just about telling his story. It was about rewriting the stories of others. he launched a project called From Pencil to Power, combining his love of sketching with advocacy. The workshops invited kids affected by the justice system to draw, write, and speak their truths. Darius led sessions in community centers, libraries, and juvenile halls, giving children safe spaces to share what they had never dared say aloud. In one of the workshops, a boy asked, "What if they don't believe me either?" Darius knelt beside him and said, "They didn't believe me at first. That's why we speak louder." Soon, Darius's impact stretched further. His story became a central part of a youth-led campaign called Know Your Rights, which aimed to educate students across the country about what to do in police encounters, how to ask for a lawyer, and how to protect themselves with knowledge. His message became a rallying cry. "I'm not the mistake they thought I was. I'm the message they needed to hear." Schools invited him to speak. Youth councils nominated him for leadership roles. What began as survival had turned into purpose. Darius still carried his sister's sketchbook everywhere he went. It had become his symbol, a reminder of the moment his truth broke through. Comment, Mike, if you believe Darius turned pain into purpose. Because sometimes the very thing meant to break us becomes the platform we rise from. Months had passed since Darius Collins walked free, but the impact of his story continued to grow. No longer just a name in a courtroom file, Darius had become a voice, powerful, clear, and determined to make others feel seen. One crisp fall morning, he stood on a stage at a middle school auditorium packed with students, teachers, and community leaders. The stage lights beamed down on him, but Darius did not flinch. This time, the spotlight was his choice. He stepped up to the microphone and looked out over the crowd. Dozens of young faces stared back, some curious, some uncertain, all waiting. Darius adjusted the mic and spoke. "It only took 2 words to change my life. Listen to me. Sometimes that's all anyone wants, just to be heard." The silence was immediate. His words landed with weight. He shared his story, from the sketchbook to the courtroom, from being silenced to being seen. He talked about fear, about not being believed, and the power of speaking anyway. He reminded them that strength does not always look loud. Sometimes it looks like standing when your knees shake. As he finished, his voice softened but stayed firm. Your voice matters. Even when they try to shut you down. Especially then. The room erupted. Students clapped and cheered. Teachers wiped away tears. One boy in the front row stood and clapped the hardest, whispering to his friend, "He sounds like me." Darius stepped back smiling, not for applause, but for connection. He now toured schools and youth centers, delivering that same message, that courage starts with voice. His sessions included sketching, storytelling, and a pledge that every student signed. "I will speak up, and I will listen." Comment, I hear you, Darius, if this story hit you deep. Because truth grows louder when one brave voice makes room for hundreds more. Darius Collins's voice did more than change his own story. It changed the system that tried to silence him. His words, just 2 of them, forced a courtroom to stop and reconsider what justice really looks like. But the ripple did not end there. Across the state and beyond, his courage became a touchstone for conversations about youth rights, systemic bias, and what it means to truly be heard. Shortly after Darius's release, Judge Ronald Marks was placed under formal ethics review. Civil rights watchdogs and legal accountability groups examined his history on the bench. Patterns emerged, patterns that had been ignored for too long. Several past cases involving young defendants were reopened. Meanwhile, lawmakers took notice. Fueled by public demand and grassroots advocacy sparked by Darius's story, a new law passed. All minors taken into custody in the state of Michigan must now be provided legal representation from the very first moment of questioning. No more silent interrogations. No more kids left alone under fluorescent lights, misunderstood and unheard. Darius did not stop with speeches and school visits. Inspired by his love for storytelling and drawing, he began working on a graphic novel based on his experience, titled 2 Words. It weaves truth with art, offering kids a way to see themselves not just as victims of injustice, but as heroes of resilience. In a recent interview, he said, "If someone like me had this book before, maybe they'd feel braver. Maybe they'd speak sooner. Maybe they'd know they weren't alone." His story, once a nearly forgotten file, now lives on in classrooms, libraries, and court reform initiatives. More importantly, it lives on in every child who finds the strength to speak, because Darius once did. Comment: I hear you, Darius, if you believe in the power of one voice to spark change. For more stories where truth breaks through injustice, check out our next video. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story that reminds us how powerful a single voice can be. Share this story, because someone out there is waiting to be heard. Myatt's, downtown Chicago, where the streets show the harshest realities of injustice. The city is alive with movement, but for some, the streets are not just a place to pass through. They are home. A homeless boy is pushed down, humiliated, and threatened by a cop. But what happens next will leave everyone speechless. 11-year-old Malik Lewis has been living on the streets since he lost his mother. He knows hunger, cold, and the feeling of being invisible. Each day is a fight for survival, but he refuses to give up. Surviving on scraps, he finds refuge near an abandoned storefront. The brick walls offer a small barrier against the wind, and the vent nearby blows out just enough warm air to keep him from freezing. One cold evening, as he warms his hands near a vent, police sirens wail. The sound makes his stomach twist. He knows what's coming. Officer Daniels, known for harassing the homeless, steps out of his patrol car. His boots hit the pavement with force, his presence casting a shadow over Malik's small frame. "Get up, dirty black. You're ruining my city." Malik barely has time to react before he's shoved to the ground. His palms scrape against the rough sidewalk, a sharp sting shooting up his arms. He doesn't cry out. He's learned that showing pain only makes it worse. The street is quiet, bystanders pretending not to see. The world moves on, unaware or unwilling to intervene. The cold seeps through his thin jacket, his fingers trembling as he grips the concrete. He wants to push himself up, to run, but he knows better. Running makes it worse. Running makes them chase. Daniel stands over him, his breath visible in the night air. The officer's hand lingers near his holster, a silent warning. I said, "Get up." Malik moves slowly, every muscle in his body tense. He doesn't look up. Looking up means eye contact, and eye contact means trouble. His heartbeat pounds in his ears, drowning out the city noise. Have you ever witnessed injustice firsthand? Share your story. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Daniels grips Malik's arm, pulling him roughly to his feet. The force of the movement sends a sharp pain through Malik's shoulder, but he doesn't cry out. He has learned that showing pain only invites more cruelty. You're nothing but a street rat. People like you don't belong here. Daniels sneers, his grip tightening. Malik swallows hard, his voice shaking. I'm just trying to survive. Instead of compassion, the officer smirks. Not my problem. The street remains silent. Bystanders shuffle past, their heads down, pretending not to see. It is easier that way, to walk away, to ignore the suffering right in front of them. A few feet away, an older woman named Mrs. Jenkins watches in horror. Her wrinkled hands tremble as she clutches her grocery bag, her eyes narrowing in disgust at the scene unfolding before her. "Leave that boy alone," she shouts, stepping forward. Daniels barely acknowledges her at first, his focus locked on Malik. He enjoys this, the power, the fear in the boy's eyes. But when Mrs. Jenkins pulls out her phone and starts recording, his smirk falters. "I said, leave him alone," she repeats, her voice stronger now, shaking with fury. The street is no longer as quiet. Others begin to slow their pace, glancing toward the confrontation. A few pull out their own phones, recording from different angles. Daniel's grip on Malik loosens slightly, but the hostility in his eyes remains. He shifts uncomfortably, noticing more people stopping to watch. A man in a business suit frowns, pulling out his own phone. A young woman across the street hesitates before stepping closer. Malik's heart pounds in his chest. He knows how this usually ends. But this time, there is something different, something he hasn't felt before. Daniels exhales sharply, his jaw tightening. "Mind your business, lady," he snaps at Mrs. Jenkins. "This kid doesn't belong here." Mrs. Jenkins doesn't flinch. "And neither do you, abusing your badge like that." More murmurs spread through the crowd. Someone whispers, "Is he really going after a kid?" Another voice mutters, "This isn't right." Daniel's posture stiffens. His gaze flickers from Malik to the growing number of phones pointed in his direction. He takes a step back, his grip finally releasing. Malik stumbles slightly, regaining his balance. His body aches, but he stays upright, his breathing unsteady. Mrs. Jenkins moves closer, standing between him and Daniels. "You should be ashamed of yourself," she says, her voice filled with conviction. "This boy deserves better. Would you step in if you saw something like this happening? Let's discuss." Mrs. Jenkins grips her phone tightly, recording every second of the abuse. Her hands tremble with anger, but her voice is steady as she shouts, "You don't get to treat people like trash just because you wear a badge." Officer Daniels freezes, his body tensing. For the first time, the weight of the moment catches up with him. His eyes flick to the phone in her hand, then to the growing number of bystanders now holding up their own phones, capturing everything. The confidence that once filled him starts to waver. His grip on Malik loosens, but not before he gives the boy one final shove. Malik stumbles back, his thin frame barely able to absorb the impact. The pain radiates through his body, but he refuses to fall. Daniels clenches his jaw. He scans the crowd, searching for an escape from the unwanted attention. He knows what happens when videos like this go viral. He knows his actions are no longer just words against a boy with no home. Without another word, he storms off, his boots slamming against the pavement as he heads for his patrol car. He yanks the door open, slams it shut, and speeds away, tires screeching against the asphalt. The tension lingers even after he's gone. The air is thick with the weight of what just happened. The crowd murmurs, eyes darting from Malik to Mrs. Jenkins, then back to their phones, their screens still recording. Mrs. Jenkins wastes no time. With swift fingers, she uploads the video to social media. The caption is simple but powerful. "This is what happens in our city. This is what happens when no one is watching. But today, we watched." Within hours, the video spreads like wildfire. People across the country share it, outraged at the injustice they see. News outlets pick it up, hashtags flood timelines. Justice for Malik trends nationwide. Comments flood in from people demanding accountability. Activists amplify the footage, calling for an official investigation into Officer Daniels. The mayor releases a statement, acknowledging the growing outrage and promising that the incident will be reviewed. Malik watches the events unfold from a small cafe, where Mrs. Jenkins has taken him for a warm meal. The reality of the situation still hasn't fully sunk in. He had spent so long feeling invisible, only to now have the world speaking his name. Mrs. Jenkins pats his hand reassuringly. They see you now, child, and they're not going to let this go. For the first time in a long time, Malik feels something foreign. Hope. Do you think social media helps expose injustice? Drop your thoughts below. By morning, the mayor's office issues a statement. We are launching an investigation. The words spread quickly across news outlets and social media, fueling the fire of public outrage. The city, once indifferent to Malik's suffering, is now paying attention. Malik, exhausted and scared, is taken in by a local shelter. The bed is small, but it's warm. The meals are simple, but they are more than he has had in days. Mrs. Jenkins stays by his side, ensuring he is safe, ensuring he is seen. But even in the quiet of the shelter, he knows the battle isn't over. The video reaches national news. Anchor after anchor discusses the footage, dissecting every second. How many more times must we see this? One commentator demands. This officer must be held accountable. Protesters chant outside the police station. The crowd grows by the hour, signs held high, voices echoing in the streets. The police department remains silent at first, hoping the outrage will fade. But the world is watching. Under immense pressure, Officer Daniels is suspended pending an investigation. It is not enough, not yet, but it is a start. Malik watches the protests unfold from the shelter's common area, the television buzzing with updates. His name is being spoken in places he never imagined. Strangers fight for him, demand justice for him. He is no longer invisible. Mrs. Jenkins sits beside him, her hand warm over his own. They won't stop fighting, baby, and neither will we. The shelter staff speaks in hushed voices as they discuss the growing movement. Volunteers arrive with donations, offering clothes, food, and supplies for Malik and other children in need. The shelter director assures him that he is safe. But Malik knows that safety is never guaranteed, not when the world has shown him otherwise. Outside the police station, the crowd intensifies. Reporters capture every moment as chants grow louder. Activists and community leaders take the stage, demanding not just an investigation, but real consequences. Suspension is not justice, one speaker calls out. This is not accountability. The mayor's office, now fully aware of the unrest, releases a second statement. We hear the concerns of our citizens and will ensure this matter is handled with full transparency. But the people are not satisfied with words. They want action. Officer Daniels, now hidden from public view, faces mounting scrutiny. Internal Affairs begins questioning his record, his history of complaints, his unchecked authority. The weight of his actions now threatens to crush the power he once wielded so easily. Malik listens to the updates, his fingers tracing the edge of his blanket. He wonders if this moment will truly change anything, if his suffering will lead to something greater than just a headline. Mrs. Jenkins looks at him with knowing eyes. They see you now, she reminds him, and they won't forget. Should corrupt cops face harsher punishments? Let's talk. A few days later, a wealthy businessman named Jordan Whitmore sits in his office, watching the footage on his large screen. The video of Malik's abuse has been playing on every major news channel, but something about the boy's resilience tugs at him in a way he can't ignore. That boy. He has no home, no family. He asks his assistant, his brow furrowed. The assistant shakes her head. No, sir. He's been living on the streets since his mother passed away. Right now, he's at a shelter. Whitmore exhales slowly, tapping his fingers against his desk. He has built his empire by making decisive moves, and today is no different. He won't just stand by and watch. The next morning, a sleek black SUV pulls up outside the shelter. The vehicle stands out among the older cars and worn-down surroundings. People glance at it curiously, wondering who could possibly be visiting a place like this. Inside, Malik finishes his breakfast, still adjusting to life within the shelter's walls. When a staff member calls his name, he hesitates before stepping outside, squinting at the bright morning sun. A tall man in an expensive suit approaches him. His presence is commanding, yet there's warmth in his eyes. "Malik," he says with a nod. "I saw what happened to you, son, and I want to help." Malik shifts uncomfortably, glancing back toward the shelter door. Mrs. Jenkins stands nearby, watching protectively. Whitmore reaches into his coat pocket and pulls out an envelope. He hands it to Malik, who hesitantly takes it. Inside, he finds documents, papers for a scholarship, a place to stay, a second chance. "I don't want anything in return," Whitmore assures him. "I just believe in giving people the opportunities they deserve." Malik swallows hard, staring at the papers in his hands. A mixture of emotions swirls inside him: hope, fear, doubt. He has never been offered something like this before, not without a catch. Mrs. Jenkins steps forward, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It's your choice, baby, but maybe this is the break you've been waiting for." Malik takes a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the envelope. The world has been cruel to him for so long. Could he trust this stranger's kindness? Would you accept help from a stranger? Why or why not? Let's discuss. After weeks of relentless public pressure, the moment finally arrives. Officer Daniels is arrested for assault and misconduct. The video, now seen by millions, has left no room for denial. The people demanded justice, and this time, the system could not ignore them. The police department, facing scrutiny from every direction, releases a statement. "We acknowledge the failures in handling this situation and are committed to change. Effective immediately, we are enacting reforms for how officers interact with the homeless community." Malik, once just a boy struggling to survive, is now a symbol of resilience. The world sees him differently now, not as an invisible child on the streets, but as someone whose voice could no longer be silenced. His story has reached every corner of the country, sparking conversations about accountability, justice, and the treatment of those society so often neglects. At a press conference, Malik stands beside Jordan Whitmore. Dressed in clothes that finally fit him, standing taller than before, he speaks into the microphone, his voice steady. "No one deserves to be treated like they don't matter. People like me, we exist. We deserve to be seen, to be heard, to be treated like human beings." The crowd listens in silence, absorbing his words. Mrs. Jenkins, standing in the front row, wipes a tear from her eye, pride radiating from her. Meanwhile, in a crowded courtroom, Officer Daniels sits with his head down, the weight of his actions finally pressing upon him. His arrogance is gone, replaced by the cold reality of consequence. The judge reads the charges aloud, and the room watches as he is led away in handcuffs. Justice, for once, is not just a word. Outside, the people who fought for Malik celebrate. The movement didn't just win one battle, it forced a system to acknowledge the truth. Malik watches the celebration from a distance, unsure of how to feel. His life has changed in ways he never expected. He has a place to stay, a future that seems less uncertain, but the scars of his past remain. He wonders if people will remember his story when the next crisis comes, or if they will move on, forgetting the fight that brought him here. The shelter staff watches him carefully, aware of the weight he carries. Mrs. Jenkins sits beside him, her warmth unwavering. "You changed something, child," she says softly. "No one can take that away." Malik nods, letting her words sink in. He doesn't know what comes next, but for the first time in a long time, he believes that maybe, just maybe, things can get better. Do you believe justice was served? Let's talk. Washington, D.C. Friday, March the 28th, 2022, 2:45 p.m. The courtroom was seconds away from sealing the fate of an innocent woman. The prosecution was confident, the jury was convinced, and the judge was prepared to rule. Then, from the back of the gallery, a voice rang out, sharp, clear, and young. "Ma'am, he is framing you!" Gasps filled the room. Heads turned. The gavel froze midair. This was not just a courtroom drama. This was the moment when a 12-year-old homeless boy, armed with nothing but his courage and the truth, stood up against a corrupt machine and changed everything. Meet Jalen Wright. Once arrested by the very agent now on trial, Jalen had every reason to stay silent. He had been overlooked, doubted, and dismissed his whole life. But when he recognized the real criminal hiding in plain sight, he could not hold back, because truth does not come from position, it comes from purpose. The agent on trial, FBI Special Agent Rachel Monroe, had once put cuffs on Jalen in a mistaken identity sweep. She later cleared him and even checked in on him once she realized he had no home to return to. But that one act of decency planted a seed. And now, as she stood accused of criminal conspiracy, framed by one of her own colleagues, it was Jalen who refused to let her fall alone. What unfolded next would stun the courtroom, the city, and eventually the nation. A corrupt jury, a silent courtroom, a loud truth. This is not just about justice, this is about redemption, bravery, and a reminder that sometimes the smallest voice is the one that carries the weight of real change. Comment: Courage can save lives. If you're ready to witness how one sentence rewrote the ending of a rigged case. Because when Jalen spoke up, the system was forced to listen. Jalen Wright had already lived through more than most kids his age. At just 12 years old, he called a downtown shelter in Washington, D.C., his home. His parents had died in a car crash 2 years earlier, leaving him without family, without a safety net, and without much more than a small backpack and a memory that never let go of details. He was quiet, observant, and unnoticed. But what people did not see was that Jalen noticed everything. One cold night, while trying to sleep behind a diner, Jalen overheard voices. He sat up and peeked through the cracked dumpster lid. 2 men, dressed too clean for the alley, stood beneath a flickering streetlight. One handed the other a thick envelope. The other man passed over a folder. No names, no words above a whisper. But Jalen saw their faces, memorized their shoes, and caught a glimpse of the license plate as the car pulled away. He thought nothing of it until 3 days later. Sitting on the floor of the shelter, watching the old TV in the corner, he saw one of the men from the alley on screen. He was testifying in court, and not just any court. He was the key witness in a case against FBI Special Agent Claire Monroe. Jalen froze. Claire Monroe, the woman who had arrested him for loitering outside a federal building months earlier. She had treated him with cold efficiency, no softness, no conversation, just handcuffs and silence. But she had not been cruel, and days after the arrest she returned, not to punish, but to release, to admit a mistake. That stuck with Jalen, because adults did not usually admit when they were wrong. Now she was the one in handcuffs. Now she was the one everyone believed was guilty. She treated me like I didn't matter, Jalen whispered to himself, but she's not dirty. He remembered the man from the alley, the envelope, the glance over his shoulder. It clicked. Jalen had a choice. He could stay quiet, hide, keep his head down and hope the system never noticed him again, or he could speak. Speak up for the woman who once judged him. Speak up against the man now calling her corrupt. Speak the truth, even if no one wanted to hear it from a kid like him. He chose courage. Comment brain. If you believe sometimes the people who save us are the ones we least expect. Because Jalen Wright saw what others missed and refused to stay silent. Agent Claire Monroe sat motionless at the defense table, her hands clenched tightly in front of her. The courtroom buzzed with finality. The prosecution had wrapped up their argument. The jury seemed firmly convinced, and Judge Rollins adjusted his glasses with the weight of sentencing heavy in the air. "The evidence is overwhelming," the prosecutor declared, voice booming with authority. "We ask for immediate sentencing." Judge Rollins gave a slow nod. "Agent Monroe, any final words before judgment is passed?" Before she could open her mouth, the courtroom doors burst open. Jalen Wright, breathless and wide-eyed, ran through the aisle. His voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Ma'am, he is framing you. I saw him. I saw everything." Gasps scattered across the room like falling glass. Every head turned. Jalen pointed straight at the prosecution's star witness, a man named Martin Keene. The very man who had given detailed, confident testimony against Agent Monroe. He paid someone behind Silver's diner. I was there. He gave him an envelope and took a folder. I saw it all. The courtroom broke into chaos. "Order!" Judge Rollins shouted, slamming the gavel. "Who is this boy?" Agent Monroe stared in disbelief. "That's the boy I arrested months ago. What is he doing here?" Jalen stood firm, breathing hard. "I know, I'm just a kid. And I know you don't believe people like me. But I remember his face. I remember his shoes. And I remember what I saw." Martin Keene turned pale. The room fell into a stunned silence. Judge Rollins looked between Jalen, Monroe, and Keene. "Bailiff," he said, voice calm but firm, "remove the jury. This court will enter emergency review." Jalen didn't move. He just looked at Monroe and nodded. She looked back, eyes wide with something between shock and gratitude. Comment. Let him speak. If you believe every voice deserves to be heard, no matter their past. Because when Jalen interrupted the courtroom, he did more than speak up. He cracked open the truth. Jalen Wright sat nervously in the witness chair, legs swinging slightly as the courtroom stared. A bailiff handed him a Bible, and he swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. His voice trembled, but his eyes never wavered. He looked directly at the judge. "The man on the stand met someone behind Silver's diner," Jalen said, pointing toward Martin Keene, the prosecution's star witness. He gave him a black folder and said, "She won't know what hit her." A murmur moved through the gallery. The prosecutor rolled his eyes and scoffed. "Your Honor, This is hearsay from a homeless child with no record of credibility. But Monroe's defense attorney stood up calmly, holding a remote in hand. Actually, Your Honor, we pulled security footage from a gas station across the alley. He clicked the remote. A monitor flickered on. Boom. Grainy but clear footage showed Martin Keene behind Silver's diner. He exchanged a folder with an unidentified man. The timestamp matched the night Jalen described. The angle even caught a partial license plate. Enough for verification. Gasps spread across the courtroom. Keene turned in his seat, visibly shaken. Truth comes in many forms, the defense attorney added. Sometimes it walks in when you least expect it. Judge Rollins leaned forward, gripping the edge of the bench. His gaze locked on Keene, then shifted to Jalen. Young man, your testimony just changed the direction of this entire case. In less than an hour, the trial unraveled. The prosecution requested a recess. The media outside exploded with headlines. What was once an open and shut case against an FBI agent had turned into a firestorm of corruption. Comment, thumbs up, if you believe truth comes from the most unexpected places. Because Jalen didn't just remember, he revealed. The courtroom atmosphere was electric. The video footage had shaken the prosecution's foundation, but what came next detonated the entire case. Martin Keene, the star witness, sat hunched in the stand, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. The judge had just ordered a direct inquiry. Under oath and intense questioning, the pressure cracked him wide open. They threatened me. I had no choice, Keene stammered, voice barely above a whisper. Gasps swept through the courtroom. The prosecutor paled. Monroe's defense attorney stood stone-faced as the unraveling began. Keene confessed that he had been coerced into testifying falsely against Agent Monroe, but that was only the beginning. Within hours, a deeper investigation was launched by federal authorities present in the courtroom. What emerged was a conspiracy far greater than a single corrupt witness. 2 jurors had been bribed. 3 critical documents submitted as evidence had been forged. A small but powerful internal corruption ring had been operating beneath the surface, one that had now been exposed, all thanks to the courage of a 12-year-old boy. Judge Rollins, face flushed with disbelief and fury, slammed his gavel with a thunderous crack. All charges against Agent Claire Monroe are dropped. An investigation will be launched immediately into all parties involved. This court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to file breaking news. The jury was dismissed. And at the center of it all, Jalen stood still. Agent Monroe turned slowly to him. Her voice was quiet, almost disbelieving. "Why would you help me? After everything?" Jalen looked up, his eyes steady. "Because I know what it's like to not be believed. And no one deserves that." Tears welled in Monroe's eyes. Comment, justice wins, if you felt chills hearing Jalen speak truth to power. Because the fight for justice is not about age or status. It is about courage. In the days following the courtroom bombshell, the fallout was swift and far-reaching. The FBI launched a full internal review, uncovering layers of misconduct that had long been buried beneath false loyalty and silence. At a nationally televised press conference, the Bureau made a rare acknowledgement. Standing before a wall of cameras, the FBI director paused, then said clearly, "We thank Jalen Wright for his courage. Because of him, a serious breach in justice was stopped." Jalen stood quietly off to the side, dressed in a shirt too big and shoes a little worn, but with a presence that could not be ignored. Agent Claire Monroe, now exonerated, requested that she be placed in charge of Jalen's case. "He saved my life," she said to the review board. "The least I can do is help him live his." After weeks of hearings, paperwork, and psychological evaluations, Monroe was granted temporary guardianship of Jalen. With his consent, she opened her home to him, beginning a new chapter neither of them had seen coming. It was not a fairy tale, but it was real. Jalen moved into Monroe's modest townhouse just outside the city. He got his own room, the first he'd had in years. Posters of athletes and comic book heroes lined the walls. A sketch pad sat on the desk, always open. Dinners were quiet at first. Monroe was careful not to overstep. Jalen was cautious not to let his guard down. But something unspoken grew between them, a mutual understanding forged in truth and redemption. "We're not friends yet," Jalen said one night over spaghetti, "but we're not enemies anymore." Monroe smiled. "Fair enough." They went grocery shopping together. She helped him register at a new school. He taught her how to use a popular sketch app. And gradually, trust began to replace trauma. Jalen's story became a symbol of how even the most broken stories could find healing. Not perfection, not quick fixes, but healing through truth and effort and time. Comment heart eyes if you believe even broken stories can find healing. Because sometimes courage writes the first line of a brand new chapter. Months after the courtroom collapse and the formation of an unexpected new home, Jalen Wright stood under the bright lights of a national youth leadership stage. The room was full of dignitaries, students, community leaders, and families. He had been chosen to receive the National Courage Youth Award. Wearing a clean blazer, the sleeves still a little long, Jalen stepped up to the podium. Behind him stood Claire Monroe, hands folded, her eyes already brimming with emotion. The applause faded. The room quieted. Jalen took a breath. "I didn't save an agent," he began, his voice steady but sincere. "I saved someone who deserved a second chance, just like I did." There was no flourish, no grand statement, just truth, clear and humbling. He looked out into the crowd and continued, "People thought I didn't matter, that I was just a kid with no future. But someone gave me a reason to speak up. And I realized that second chances aren't gifts, they're decisions. I made mine." He paused, then glanced back at Monroe. She stepped forward and gently took his hand. The entire auditorium rose to its feet. Applause echoed across the room. Some wiped tears. Others clapped until their hands ached. It was a single image that would circulate across headlines and timelines. A boy, once written off by the system, holding hands with the woman once accused by it. A picture of trust, redemption, and the power of courageous connection. Comment: Jalen is a hero if you believe in second chances and brave hearts. Because in the end, real heroes are not always the ones in capes. They're the ones who speak when silence feels safer. What started with a desperate shout in a courtroom has now grown into something few could have imagined. Jalen Wright and Agent Claire Monroe, once on opposite sides of the law, now stand side by side as allies. Together, they travel the country speaking at youth justice events, court reform panels, and school assemblies. Their message is simple but powerful. Truth matters. Empathy saves. And every child deserves to be heard. Jalen, now 13, uses his experience to advocate for better treatment of juvenile witnesses in the justice system. His story helped spark a national review of courtroom protocols involving minors. As a result, several states have introduced new policies ensuring young witnesses are given advocates, not interrogations. Just because we're kids, Jalen says, doesn't mean we don't know what we see. Monroe, once nearly condemned by her own agency, now leads training workshops within federal law enforcement on how to recognize systemic bias and rebuild trust with marginalized communities. Their story, a former agent and a once homeless boy, has become a national case study in redemption, change, and the unexpected bonds that can emerge from broken systems. It began with confrontation. It ended with connection. Comment: I still believe, if you know that hope can rise from the hardest places. For more stories that will shake your soul and restore your hope, watch our next video. Black girl interrupted the judge. My stepfather is lying. Her revelation shocked everyone. Boy walks into courtroom, points at the mayor. What he says shocks the city. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next moment where truth takes the stand. Share this story. Someone out there needs to hear that. Even in chaos, courage lives. Explosion. The packed courtroom in Boston, Massachusetts, was silent. Rows of people filled every seat, their eyes locked on the small figure standing in the center of the room. The tension was thick, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Jamal Harris, just 10 years old, stood with his hands clenched at his sides. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, but he refused to let his fear show. He had come too far to back down now. The room felt massive, the walls towering around him, but he forced himself to stand tall. Opposite him, Judge Victoria Langley sat high above the courtroom, her sharp gaze locked onto him. She was a well-known hardliner, feared by many, respected by few. Even now, with her pregnant belly barely concealed beneath her robe, her presence radiated authority. There was no sign of warmth or patience in her expression. She leaned forward slightly, her expression cold. You think you're better than everyone, huh? Her voice cut through the silence like a knife, laced with skepticism. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Attorneys exchanged glances. Spectators shifted in their seats. No one dared to speak. The weight of the judge's words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Jamal inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He could feel the weight of countless eyes watching, waiting to see what he would do next. The pressure was suffocating, but he had no choice but to face it head-on. He had been underestimated before, dismissed as just another kid from the wrong side of town. But today, he wasn't going to let that define him. The judge's gavel rested within her grasp. Her fingers curled tightly around the handle. The tension between them was palpable. The room was waiting, the silence stretching on. Jamal's pulse pounded in his ears. He could feel sweat forming at the back of his neck, but he held his ground. His fingers twitched slightly at his sides, but he refused to let them shake. The attorneys, sitting at their respective tables, whispered among themselves. Reporters in the gallery leaned forward, their pens poised over their notepads. The jury, though silent, watched with curiosity. Jamal could hear the faint clicking of a camera somewhere in the back of the courtroom. Every move he made, every breath he took, was being recorded, scrutinized. Judge Langley's lips pressed into a thin line as she waited for his response. The intensity of her stare didn't waver, and Jamal knew this was a test. The question she had asked wasn't just about him. It was about the case, about everything that had led him here. This was it. This was his moment. He exhaled slowly, grounding himself. He knew the truth. He knew why he was here. And he knew that no matter how much the judge doubted him, he had to stand firm. When justice is tested, will truth prevail? One boy's courage is about to change everything. Have you ever been underestimated but proved people wrong? Let's talk. Just 24 hours earlier, Jamal Harris was walking home, his backpack slung over one shoulder, the chilly Boston air nipping at his face. The street was quiet, only the occasional honk of a distant car breaking the silence. He had taken this route hundreds of times before, but tonight felt different. Something in the air, in the way the streetlights flickered, made his steps slow. Then he heard it. The screech of tires, the unmistakable sound of rubber skidding against asphalt. He turned his head just in time to see an SUV careening out of control, its headlights cutting jagged patterns through the darkness. His heart pounded as the vehicle spun wildly before slamming into a street pole with a deafening crash. Jamal stood frozen for half a second before his feet moved on their own. The crumpled hood of the SUV hissed, steam rising from beneath it. He could hear the sputtering engine, the faint smell of gasoline thick in the air. Someone was inside. He rushed forward, his pulse roaring in his ears. Through the shattered window, he saw a woman slumped over the steering wheel, her breathing shallow. The streetlight overhead illuminated her face, and recognition struck him like a bolt of lightning. Judge Victoria Langley. His breath caught. The same Judge Langley who ruled her courtroom like an iron fortress, the same woman who had dismissed people like him without a second thought. But none of that mattered now. She was trapped, and the car was leaking fuel. Jamal yanked at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. He pounded on the window. "You have to get out! The car's leaking fuel," he shouted. Langley stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach, cradling it as panic flashed across her face. "My baby," she whispered, her voice weak. Jamal didn't hesitate. He braced his foot against the side of the SUV and pulled with all his strength. Metal groaned, the door inching open just enough for him to squeeze his hands through. "Come on, you have to move," he urged. With trembling limbs, Langley tried to push herself up. Jamal reached inside, gripping her arm, using every ounce of strength he had to haul her out of the wreckage. She staggered, unsteady, leaning on him as he pulled her to safety. And then the SUV erupted in flames. A blast of heat surged behind them, sending Jamal and Langley stumbling forward. The fire roared, swallowing the vehicle whole. He shielded his face, his heart hammering as the reality of how close they had come sank in. Langley clutched her stomach, her breaths coming in uneven gasps. "Would you have risked your life to save someone who might not respect you? Let's discuss." Jamal Harris stood on the pavement, his chest still rising and falling from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The fire from the SUV crackled behind him, black smoke billowing into the cold night air. He had just saved Judge Victoria Langley and her unborn child from certain death. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt fear. Sirens blared in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Red and blue lights flickered against the nearby buildings as two police cruisers skidded to a stop. The moment the officers stepped out, hands hovering over their holsters, Jamal knew something was wrong. Before he could explain, a voice rang out from the crowd of bystanders. "That boy was near the car before it crashed." Jamal whipped his head around, eyes wide. A man pointed straight at him, his expression twisted with suspicion. Others in the crowd murmured in agreement, nodding as if the accusation made perfect sense. Officer Reynolds, a tall man with a hardened expression, approached. "What were you doing here, kid?" Jamal's pulse pounded. "I saved her. The car crashed and I pulled her out before it exploded. Ask her." Reynolds didn't let go of his arm. "We'll sort this out at the station." "No," Jamal protested, his voice cracking. "I didn't do anything wrong." But Judge Langley, still dazed from the accident, remained silent. Her lack of defense sealed his fate. Another officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The cold metal snapped around Jamal's wrists before he could protest again. The crowd's murmurs turned into whispers. Some shook their heads, while others simply watched. He scanned the faces, searching for anyone who would stand up for him. But the bystanders remained passive, unwilling to get involved. Jamal swallowed hard, his chest tightening. He turned his head toward Langley, willing her to speak, to tell them the truth. But she was still clutching her stomach, eyes unfocused, lost in shock. Whether she realized what was happening or not, she didn't stop them. Reynolds guided Jamal toward the squad car, his grip firm. "You can explain yourself at the station." Jamal tried again, desperation creeping into his voice. "Please, I saved her." His words fell on deaf ears. The car door opened, and Jamal was pushed inside. The door slammed shut, the sound final, like a cell door locking him away from the world. Through the window, he could still see the wreckage, the flickering flames, the people watching from a distance. He wanted to scream to force them to see the truth. Instead, he clenched his fists, pressing them into his lap, his wrists aching against the cuffs. He had risked everything to save a life, and now he was being treated like a criminal. The engine rumbled to life, and the car pulled away, the flashing lights reflecting off the glass. He didn't know what awaited him at the station, but one thing was clear. Justice wasn't blind. Do you think the system automatically assumes the worst about certain people? Let's discuss. Jamal Harris stood in the middle of the courtroom, his heart pounding, but his stance unwavering. The weight of every eye in the room pressed against him, but he refused to look away. Across from him, Judge Victoria Langley sat high on the bench, her expression unreadable. The same woman whose life he had saved now had the power to decide his fate. "I didn't do anything wrong," Jamal said, his voice steady. "I saved you." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The tension was thick, the air charged with anticipation. Langley studied him for a long moment, her fingers lightly tapping against the bench. "Do you have proof you didn't cause the accident?" she asked. Gasps filled the room. Even now, she doubted him. Jamal clenched his fists, fighting back frustration. He had risked his life, yet he was the one standing trial, the one forced to prove his innocence. He turned toward his attorney, who nodded and stepped forward. "Your Honor, the street cameras recorded everything. The footage proves that Jamal didn't cause the crash. He saved you." Judge Langley blinked, her composed expression faltering for the first time. The tension in the room shifted as the prosecution exchanged uncertain glances. The weight of the evidence was undeniable. "Play the footage," she ordered. The courtroom hushed as a screen flickered to life. The grainy surveillance video played, capturing every second of what had happened that night. The SUV spinning out of control, the violent crash. And then, Jamal running toward the wreck, pulling Langley from the burning vehicle. The room was silent as the video ended. All eyes turned to the judge. Langley's face had gone pale. She sat back in her chair, fingers gripping the armrests. She exhaled slowly, as if the weight of the truth had finally settled upon her shoulders. Jamal didn't look away. He had spent the last 24 hours fighting to be heard, to be seen for who he truly was, not the suspect they assumed him to be, but the hero he had proven himself to be. Have you ever had to prove your innocence, despite doing the right thing? Share your experience. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as the video began to play. Every eye in the room remained glued to the screen, watching the events unfold in real time. The grainy footage captured the SUV spinning out of control, slamming into the street pole. Then, a small figure appeared, Jamal Harris. The entire courtroom watched as he sprinted toward the wreckage, his every movement filled with urgency. There was no hesitation, no mischief, only bravery. The screen flickered, showing him yanking the door open, pulling Judge Victoria Langley from the vehicle. He steadied her, urging her to move, before the SUV exploded in a fiery blast. Murmurs spread through the room. Some spectators shifted in their seats, exchanging stunned glances. Even the prosecution exchanged uncomfortable looks. There was no denying what they had just witnessed. Judge Langley's face turned red. Her hands gripped the edges of her bench, her composed expression cracking. She had built a reputation as a woman who was tough but fair. But today, she had been neither. Jamal stood tall, his hands still clenched at his sides. He had spent the last 24 hours fighting to be heard, and now the truth was playing out for everyone to see. Langley cleared her throat, straightened her shoulders, and spoke, her voice steady but softer than before. The charges against Jamal Harris are dismissed. A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. Relief flickered across the faces of some, while others remained silent, grappling with what had just unfolded. Jamal's attorney nodded but said nothing. The video had done all the talking necessary. Judge Langley hesitated for a moment longer before speaking again. "This court stands adjourned." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, but its finality did not erase the weight of the moment. The woman who prided herself on fairness had judged without proof, and now she had been forced to face her own error. Jamal took a slow breath. He had fought for his dignity and won. But the damage had already been done. Do you believe apologies are enough when someone's dignity is on the line? Let's discuss. Hours later, Jamal Harris sat on the worn-out couch in his family's small apartment, replaying the day's events in his mind. The courtroom, the video, the moment Judge Langley finally acknowledged the truth. He should have felt victorious, but exhaustion weighed heavily on him. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Jamal's mother, Tanya, exchanged a wary glance with him before moving to open it. Standing in the dimly lit hallway, looking more uncomfortable than he had ever seen her, was Judge Victoria Langley. "Judge Langley," Tanya said, her voice laced with confusion. Langley nodded, shifting her weight as if uncertain about being there. "I was wrong," she admitted, her tone quieter than it had been in the courtroom. "And I owe your son more than an apology." Jamal, still seated, frowned slightly. He wasn't expecting this. Langley reached into her bag and pulled out a plain white envelope. She hesitated for a moment before handing it to Jamal. His fingers brushed against the paper, feeling its weight before he carefully opened it. Inside was a full scholarship to one of the best schools in the state. His mother gasped softly, one hand covering her mouth. Jamal's eyes scanned the letter, his heart hammering in his chest. "I didn't save you for a reward," he finally said, looking up at Langley, his voice steady. Langley exhaled, something shifting in her expression. For the first time, she looked at him not as a defendant, not as a suspect, but as an equal. "I know. That's why you deserve it." For a long moment, no one spoke. Tanya's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she placed a hand on her son's shoulder. Langley, still out of place in the small apartment, seemed to finally relax. Jamal looked down at the letter once more, the weight of it sinking in. He had fought so hard just to be heard. Now, for the first time, someone in power was truly listening. Do you think people can truly change? Share your thoughts. Jamal's courage forced a judge to rethink her own biases. He had stood alone in a courtroom demanding the truth be seen. He had fought against assumptions that could have destroyed him. And in the end, he had won, not just his freedom, but something much greater. His heroism didn't just save Langley's life. It changed the way she saw justice. For years, she had believed in the system she upheld, never questioning the fairness of her rulings. But when she looked at Jamal, she saw something she couldn't ignore. A boy who had done everything right and still ended up in handcuffs. And in return, Langley made a choice to open doors instead of closing them. She had once been a judge who valued punishment over understanding. Now, she was someone who recognized the power of second chances. Jamal's story spread beyond the courtroom. It became a symbol of resilience, of the strength it takes to stand tall, even when the world tries to push you down. People across the city spoke his name. Teachers shared his story with students, and young boys who looked like him saw a glimpse of hope where there had once been fear. As days passed, Jamal adjusted to his new reality. The scholarship Langley had given him opened doors he had never imagined walking through. He attended a school where opportunity wasn't just a dream, but an expectation. Yet, he never forgot where he came from, or the fight it took to get there. He often thought about that night, the screeching tires, the fire, the fear. He thought about the way people looked at him when the police arrived, the way their assumptions nearly cost him everything. But he also thought about the change that had come from it, not just for himself, but for the people who would come after him. Langley, too, was changed. She carried Jamal's story with her into every courtroom, into every decision she made. She no longer saw justice as a rigid force, but as something that could bend when needed, something that could listen. She made sure that every ruling she delivered was based not just on evidence, but on understanding. Jamal's journey had rewritten the future, not just for him, but for others like him who might have faced the same fate. One brave act had changed everything. What's the biggest lesson from Jamal's journey? Let's talk in the comments. When a child speaks up, will the truth finally be heard? A shocking revelation is about to change everything. The packed courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the weight of curiosity thick in the air. Every seat was filled, the audience leaning forward in anticipation of what was about to unfold. Lawyers shuffled papers, reporters whispered into their microphones, and the judge sat high above them all, eyes locked on the small boy standing before him. Elijah Walker, just 10 years old, stood alone at the center of it all. His heart pounded in his chest, his small hands clenched at his sides. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay strong. The courtroom air felt thick, pressing in on him, but he didn't let it shake him. He had come too far to falter now. In front of him, lying on the courtroom table, was a newborn baby wrapped in a soft, white blanket. The infant stirred slightly, letting out a quiet whimper that momentarily broke the heavy silence. The sound made Elijah's breath hitch, but he didn't look away. His focus remained on the judge, unwavering. The judge, an imposing figure with piercing eyes and a skeptical expression, leaned forward. He cleared his throat, his voice deep and firm. "You expect us to believe this child belongs to you?" Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The audience exchanged looks of disbelief and curiosity. The murmurs grew louder as people whispered among themselves. Elijah could feel their judgment, their doubt, but he had already prepared for this moment. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. The prosecution lawyer leaned in, adjusting his tie. "This is a serious claim, young man. Do you understand the weight of what you're saying?" Elijah's jaw tightened, but he didn't waver. "Yes, Your Honor," he said firmly, his voice stronger than he expected. He had practiced this answer in his head over and over again, and he knew there was no room for hesitation now. The judge tapped his gavel lightly against the bench, signaling for order. The whispers died down, and the weight of silence pressed heavier upon Elijah's small frame. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, but he remained still. The courtroom door creaked as someone entered, but Elijah didn't turn to look. He knew every movement in the room could be a distraction, and he couldn't afford to lose focus. This was his moment. He couldn't back down. The baby whimpered again, her tiny fingers curling slightly over the fabric of the blanket. The sound filled the room, reminding everyone just how real this situation was. Elijah's gaze didn't falter. He stood taller, knowing that his words, his truth, were the only things that mattered now. The room fell into silence. Every eye in the courtroom was on him, waiting, watching, judging. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Have you ever spoken up when no one believed you? Share your story. Just 24 hours earlier, Elijah Walker had been walking home, the chill of the evening air biting at his skin. The streets were quiet, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. His worn sneakers scuffed against the cracked sidewalk as he passed the alleyway behind the corner store, a route he had taken countless times before. Then he heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible cry. Elijah froze. The sound was faint, nearly lost beneath the distant hum of traffic. He turned toward the alley, his pulse quickening. Carefully, he stepped forward, his eyes scanning the dimly lit space between the dumpsters and discarded cardboard boxes. Another cry, fragile, pleading. His breath caught in his throat as he spotted the source. Nestled inside a worn, tattered blanket, barely visible against the cold metal of the dumpster, was a tiny baby. The infant's tiny fists trembled as it let out another weak wail, its face scrunched in discomfort. Elijah's heart pounded. His feet moved before his mind could process what he was doing. He knelt down, his hands shaking as he carefully picked up the fragile child. The baby was so small, so helpless. Its skin was cold to the touch, and Elijah instinctively wrapped it inside his jacket, pressing it close to his chest. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible over his racing heartbeat. "I got you." He looked around, searching for any sign of who might have left the baby there. But the alley was empty. Whoever had abandoned this child was long gone. Elijah knew he had to act fast. He ran, his legs burning as he sprinted through the streets toward home. He didn't stop until he burst through the door of his grandmother's small apartment, gasping for breath. "Mama, look! Someone left him all alone," he exclaimed, his voice filled with urgency. Miss Ruby, his grandmother, turned from the stove, her eyes widening at the sight of Elijah cradling the tiny bundle. She rushed over, her experienced hands reaching for the baby, her face a mixture of shock and concern. "Lord, have mercy," she breathed, gently peeling back the jacket to get a better look. The baby stirred, letting out a weak whimper. "Elijah, where did you find this child?" "Behind the store, near the dumpster," he said quickly. "Someone just left him there." "I couldn't leave him." Miss Ruby hesitated, her brows knitting together as she took in the situation. She was a woman of deep wisdom, someone who had seen the world's cruelty and kindness in equal measure. She knew the weight of this moment, the responsibility now resting in their hands. She sighed, nodding slowly. "We'll take him to the hospital in the morning. For now, we need to keep him warm." Elijah exhaled in relief, watching as Miss Ruby cradled the baby with care. He had done the right thing. But something in his gut told him this was just the beginning of something much bigger than he could have imagined. What would you do if you found a baby abandoned like this? Let's talk. The next morning, Elijah Walker and Miss Ruby bundled up the baby and made their way to the police station. The streets were quiet, the early morning chill still clinging to the city. Elijah held the infant close, his heart racing. He had barely slept, the weight of the night before pressing down on him. Miss Ruby walked with purpose, her grip firm on Elijah's hand. "We're doing the right thing, baby," she assured him. "That child deserves a chance." When they stepped inside the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a stark glow over the waiting area. Officers moved about, answering phones and shuffling paperwork. Miss Ruby approached the front desk, her voice steady. "We found this baby abandoned behind the store last night." The officer on duty raised an eyebrow, glancing from the bundled infant to Elijah. "You said you found the baby?" he asked, looking skeptical. Elijah nodded. "Yes, sir, all alone." Before the officer could respond, a voice cut through the room. "Bring them back, now." Elijah turned his head as another officer stepped forward. His uniform was crisp, his expression unreadable. "Come with me." They followed him down a narrow hallway into a small, dimly lit office. The officer gestured for them to sit. Miss Ruby did, but Elijah remained standing, still holding the baby. Then the officer dropped a file onto the desk. "A missing child report was filed this morning, just a few hours ago." Elijah felt his stomach tighten. Miss Ruby frowned. "By who?" The officer exhaled, watching them carefully. "Judge Henry Calloway." A beat of silence stretched between them. Elijah's mind raced. Judge Calloway, the same man presiding over his case. Miss Ruby tensed, her hand tightening on her purse. "That don't make no sense," she said slowly. "How does he know about this baby?" The officer hesitated, shifting in his seat. "That's not the strange part," he admitted. "Something about the report doesn't sit right. The way he filed it, the urgency. It's like he already knew the child was going to be found." Elijah's pulse quickened. He stole a glance at Miss Ruby, whose lips had pressed into a firm line. She reached over and gave his arm a gentle squeeze. "Something ain't right, baby," she whispered. "Be careful." Elijah nodded, gripping the baby a little tighter. He could feel it, too. Something about this didn't add up. The officer cleared his throat. "We need to keep the baby here for now. We have to follow procedure." Miss Ruby nodded, but Elijah couldn't shake the feeling in his gut. Why was the judge so involved? And why did the police seem uneasy about it? One thing was certain. This wasn't just about an abandoned child anymore. This was something much bigger. Do you think there's more to this story? Drop your thoughts below. Elijah Walker stood in the center of the packed courtroom, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. His heart pounded against his ribs as he met Judge Henry Calloway's piercing gaze. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but he refused to back down. The judge sat high above the room, his expression hard, unreadable. He gripped his gavel tightly, his knuckles turning white. "And how exactly do you know this, son?" His voice rang out, controlled but tense. Elijah took a deep breath, steadying himself. He could hear the whispers spreading through the room, the audience shifting in their seats. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. "Because of this," Elijah declared, his voice clear and unwavering, Gasps filled the room as he unfolded the document, revealing a torn birth certificate, one he had found tucked inside the baby's blanket. The name on the document made the judge's face go pale. Amelia Calloway. Elijah held up the paper for all to see. "This baby's mother is Amelia Calloway, your daughter." A stunned silence filled the courtroom. All eyes turned to Judge Calloway, who suddenly looked as if the walls were closing in on him. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Miss Ruby, seated behind Elijah, placed a hand over her chest. She had known something wasn't right, but she hadn't expected this. Elijah took a step forward, his voice growing stronger. "You abandoned your own grandson," he said, his words cutting through the silence. "And now you want to pretend he never existed." Judge Calloway slammed his gavel down, the sharp crack echoing through the room. "Enough!" he barked, his face twisting in anger. "You don't know what you're talking about." But Elijah didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know you tried to hide him. I know you didn't want anyone to find out. But I did. And now everyone else knows, too." The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The judge's breathing was heavy, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might break. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. Camera shutters clicked. The whispers turned into murmurs, then full-fledged conversations as the weight of Elijah's words settled over the room. Miss Ruby's voice cut through the noise. "It's time to tell the truth, Judge. That baby deserves better." Judge Calloway's shoulders sagged slightly, his grip on the gavel loosening. For the first time since Elijah stepped into the courtroom, the power in the room shifted. Elijah stood tall, knowing he had done what needed to be done. No matter what happened next, the truth was out. "Would you have spoken up like Elijah? Let's discuss." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Gasps, shouts, and hurried whispers filled the space as Judge Henry Calloway's face drained of color. He stammered, gripping his gavel as if it were the only thing keeping him steady. His carefully constructed world, built on power and reputation, was crumbling in front of everyone. "Order!" the judge bellowed, his voice cracking slightly. He slammed his gavel down once, twice, but the courtroom had already spiraled beyond his control. Elijah Walker stood his ground, his small frame unwavering. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room, the disbelief, the shock, the slow realization that the truth had finally surfaced. Then the prosecution attorney stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I believe the time for questioning is over. We have evidence to present." The room hushed slightly, the tension thick. The attorney motioned toward the bailiff, who handed over a thick file. "We have obtained a sworn testimony from a nurse who worked at the facility where Amelia Calloway gave birth. She confirms that the child was indeed born to your daughter. Furthermore, we have a DNA test result, verifying that this infant is your biological grandson." A murmur rippled through the audience. Reporters scrambled to write. Cameras flashed, and the sound of rustling papers filled the air. Judge Calloway's fingers twitched, his mask of authority faltering. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. The prosecution attorney didn't back down. "Your daughter was disowned, wasn't she? Cut off from your name, your wealth, and your protection. You saw this baby as a stain on your legacy, didn't you? That's why you wanted him gone." Miss Ruby clutched Elijah's shoulder, her eyes glistening with emotion. "You saved that child's life," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "And now everyone knows the truth." Elijah didn't look away from the judge. "You tried to erase him," he said. his voice steady. "But he's here, and he matters." The silence that followed was heavier than anything Elijah had ever felt. It wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a reckoning. Do you believe justice was served? Let's talk about it. With Judge Calloway exposed, the weight of his downfall reverberated through the courtroom and beyond. His once unshakable authority crumbled under the undeniable truth. The scandal sent shockwaves through the city, and within days he was forced to step down from the bench. His influence, once absolute, had been shattered by the courage of a 10-year-old boy who refused to stay silent. Meanwhile, the infant, now named Noah, was placed in the care of Miss Ruby. The state recognized her as a temporary guardian, a decision met with overwhelming public support. People from all over reached out, offering donations and resources to help. Miss Ruby, with her steady hands and boundless heart, welcomed the child into her home, knowing that love, not blood, made a family. Elijah Walker, once just a kid from a struggling neighborhood, had become something more. The news spread like wildfire. Articles, interviews, and headlines painted him as a hero. The boy who spoke the truth. The child who brought down a judge. Cameras flashed as reporters crowded outside Miss Ruby's home, eager for a statement. But Elijah wasn't interested in fame or recognition. He only cared about one thing: Noah. Standing on the small porch, he cradled the baby in his arms, shielding him from the chaos outside. "You're safe now," he whispered, his voice filled with quiet determination. Miss Ruby placed a gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You did good, baby. Real good." Elijah nodded, looking down at Noah's tiny face. The world had tried to forget this child, but he had refused to let that happen. As the sun set over the city, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Elijah knew that this was just the beginning. He had stepped up when no one else would. He had fought for justice when it would have been easier to walk away. And in doing so, he had changed more than just Noah's life. He had changed his own. What's the biggest lesson from Elijah's journey? Let's discuss in the comments. Elijah's bravery not only saved a life, but exposed a system built to silence the truth. His actions had sparked something far greater than he ever imagined. What started as a desperate attempt to do the right thing had now set off a chain reaction, shaking the very foundation of the justice system. Judge Calloway's fall sent ripples far beyond the courtroom. His resignation forced officials to re-examine past rulings, uncovering patterns of corruption that had long been ignored. The case became a national conversation, igniting discussions on accountability, privilege, and the power of speaking up. Meanwhile, Miss Ruby, now officially Noah's guardian, vowed that he would never feel abandoned again. Her home, once a place of quiet resilience, was now a haven of hope. With the help of the community, she ensured that Noah had everything he needed: a warm bed, a loving family, and a future far brighter than his past. Elijah Walker, the boy who once walked invisible through the streets of his struggling neighborhood, was no longer just a child. He had become a symbol of courage. His story traveled beyond his city, inspiring others to speak up, to question the powerful, and to fight for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against them. Reporters continued to seek him out, but Elijah never sought attention. He simply wanted to live a life where the truth mattered, where no one else would have to suffer in silence. Standing in the doorway of Miss Ruby's house, he looked down at Noah, who cooed softly in his arms. "You're safe now," he whispered once more, a promise he intended to keep. Elijah had proven that even the smallest voices could bring down giants. That justice wasn't just for those with power. It belonged to everyone. What does Elijah's story teach us about standing up for the truth? Let's talk. St. Mary's Hospital, New York, where an innocent act of kindness takes a shocking turn. Sometimes, the truth isn't what we expect. But what happens when an act of heroism is met with fear? 12-year-old Trey Simmons stands beside a hospital bed, his heart pounding. The rhythmic beeping of machines fills the room, the scent of antiseptic lingering in the air. The little girl in the bed has been unconscious for weeks, her frail body wrapped in hospital blankets, her chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. Then her fingers twitch, her eyelids flutter. A moment later she stirs for the first time, her movements weak but unmistakable. Trey leans forward, his breath catching in his throat. "She's waking up," he whispers. The doctor, standing by the monitors, turns sharply. Nurses rush forward, their hurried footsteps echoing against the tile floor. The girl blinks slowly, scanning the room in confusion until her eyes land on Trey. Suddenly, a gasp escapes her lips. Her body stiffens, her small hands clutching the blanket. The monitor's beeping accelerates. Then, her scream shatters the silence. "Get him away from me, please!" Trey stumbles back, his stomach twisting in knots. His mind races, searching for an explanation. He doesn't even know her. Why is she so afraid? The doctor moves quickly, signaling the nurses to step in. One of them gently presses the girl's shoulders down, whispering soothing words. But the terror in her eyes doesn't fade. She turns to the nearest nurse, gripping her sleeve. "Please, don't let him hurt me." Trey stands frozen, shock pulsing through his veins. He had saved her life. So why does she think he's the villain? The room buzzes with activity as more medical staff enter, trying to calm the girl. Trey watches helplessly as the doctor leans in, speaking softly, trying to understand the source of her fear. But her wide eyes remain locked on him, her breathing erratic, as if seeing him alone is too much to bear. One of the nurses turns to Trey, her voice gentle but firm. "Why don't you step outside for a moment? Give her some space." He nods slowly, his legs heavy, as he moves toward the door. Just hours ago, he had been praised for his bravery, for pulling the girl from danger and bringing her here in time to save her life. Now, he's being asked to leave, treated like the very thing she's afraid of. In the hallway, Trey leans against the cold wall, his mind spinning. The sound of the girl's distressed breathing seeps through the door, each gasp a reminder that something is terribly wrong. He clenches his fists, frustration creeping in. He doesn't understand. He only wanted to help. What do you think is happening here? Let's discuss. Just days earlier, Trey had saved the girl's life. Walking home from school, he saw a car veer off the road and crash into a fence. The sound of metal crumpling against wood echoed through the quiet street. His heart pounded as he dropped his backpack and ran toward the wreckage. Inside the car, smoke began to fill the cabin. A young girl lay unconscious, trapped beneath the steering wheel. Her small frame was barely visible through the cracked windshield, her head slumped to the side. Trey's breath caught in his throat. She wasn't moving. Without thinking, he sprinted forward, ignoring the heat radiating from the damaged vehicle. "Hold on! I'm getting you out!" he shouted. The door wouldn't budge. He yanked at the handle, his fingers slipping against the metal. Gritting his teeth, he planted his feet and pulled with everything he had. The door groaned before finally giving way. Trey wasted no time. He reached inside, arms straining as he pulled her free. She was lighter than he expected, her body limp in his arms. The acrid scent of smoke burned his throat as he stumbled backward, carrying her away from the wreckage. Behind him, the car let out a loud pop. Flames erupted from the engine, licking at the shattered windshield. He barely made it 10 steps before the vehicle was engulfed in fire. He laid the girl down gently on the pavement, brushing soot from her face. "Hey, wake up," he urged, patting her cheek lightly. She didn't respond. His pulse pounded in his ears as he checked for any sign of breathing. A weak cough, then another. Relief crashed over him as she stirred slightly, her eyelashes fluttering. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Someone had called for help. Trey sat back on his heels, chest rising and falling with deep, uneven breaths. He had done it. He had saved her. The paramedics arrived moments later, rushing to the girl's side. They checked her vitals, stabilizing her before lifting her onto a stretcher. One of them glanced at Trey. "You pulled her out?" He nodded, his body still trembling from the adrenaline. "You did good, kid. You saved her life." But as Trey stood back, watching them wheel her toward the ambulance, something unsettled him. He had expected relief, but instead a strange unease crept in. The way her fingers twitched before she fully regained consciousness. The way her face had momentarily tensed even before she opened her eyes. It was almost as if she had recognized something, even in the haze of unconsciousness. He shook the thought away, assuming it was just his nerves catching up with him. He had done the right thing. That was all that mattered, or so he thought. Would you risk your life for a stranger? Why or why not? Let's discuss. Trey had stayed by her side, visiting the hospital daily, hoping she would wake up. The doctors called him a hero. Nurses smiled at his kindness. The girl's story had spread and people admired the boy who had risked everything to save her. Each day, he would sit by her bedside, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest, waiting for any sign that she might stir. He wanted to be there when she opened her eyes, to tell her that she was safe, that everything was going to be okay. But now, as the girl wakes up, her face twists in terror at the sight of him. Tears stream down her face as she shrieks, "Why is he here?" Trey stumbles back, confused. "I saved you. I was just—" The girl pushes herself up against the hospital bed, pressing as far away from him as she can. The machines beep wildly, reflecting the panic in her body. Her breathing is ragged, her hands gripping the sheets like they are the only thing keeping her grounded. A nurse rushes in, concern flashing across her face. "Sweetheart, it's okay. You're safe." "No!" The girl sobs, shaking her head furiously. "Get him away from me, please." Trey's stomach tightens. He can't understand what's happening. This isn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to wake up and be grateful. She was supposed to recognize that he had saved her. Instead, she looks at him like he's a nightmare come to life. Before he can speak again, the door bursts open. A man rushes in, tall, broad-shouldered, his face lined with exhaustion and fear. The girl turns toward him instantly. "Daddy!" she cries, reaching out for him. The man barely spares Trey a glance before wrapping his arms around his daughter. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." Trey stands frozen, his breath caught in his throat. This isn't right. Why is she acting like this? Then the man looks up, his eyes locking onto Trey's. And in them, Trey sees something that makes his heart drop. Rage. "Get away from my daughter!" the man roars. Trey's feet move before he even registers what's happening. He stumbles back, his hands raised slightly in defense. I was just—" The man takes a step forward, his protective stance firm. "I don't care what you were doing. I don't ever want to see you near her again." The weight of those words presses down on Trey's chest. He opens his mouth to argue, to explain, to say anything, but nothing comes out. The nurses glance between them, unsure of what to do. The tension in the room is suffocating. Trey looks at the girl one last time, hoping, praying she will realize what's happening, that she will tell her father the truth. But she doesn't. She just clings to him, her face buried in his shoulder, refusing to look at Trey again. Trey swallows hard and turns away, walking out of the room without another word. Why do you think she reacted this way? Let's talk about it. Silence fills the room as everyone processes her words. The tension is thick, pressing against Trey like an unbearable weight. His mind spins, trying to make sense of what just happened. Wait, you think I... Trey stammers, his voice shaking. The girl's father tightens his hold on her, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. She remembers you, he says, his tone sharp, full of certainty. Trey's stomach twists. He shakes his head furiously. I swear, I don't know what she's talking about. His heart pounds against his ribs, his breath coming in short bursts. He looks around, searching for someone to believe him, but the doubt in the room is already settling in. The nurses exchange uneasy glances. The security guard standing by the door shifts slightly, ready to intervene. The girl clings to her father, sobbing into his chest, her body trembling. One of the nurses steps forward. Maybe we should let the girl rest. No, the father interrupts, his voice firm. I want him out of here, now. Trey's throat tightens. The security guard moves toward him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. Come on, kid, let's go. Trey feels himself being guided toward the door, but he resists, his voice rising in desperation. Please, you have to believe me. I don't know why she's saying this. I saved her. But no one listens. The door swings open, and before Trey can protest any further, he is escorted into the hallway, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. Inside the room, the father soothes his daughter, brushing her hair away from her face. You're safe now. He won't hurt you. A nurse, still standing by the bed, notices something. Her eyes narrow as she gently lifts the girl's wrist, examining an old scar beneath the hospital bracelet. It's faint but noticeable, curving along her skin like a forgotten wound. She frowns. Sir, this isn't from the accident. The father looks down, his jaw tightening. He doesn't respond right away. Instead, he pulls his daughter closer, holding her protectively as though shielding her from something unseen. Outside the room, Trey paces the hallway, his mind racing. Every scenario, every possible explanation runs through his head. Why would she say something like that? Who does she think he is? He saved her. How could she be afraid of him? A nurse walks past, avoiding his gaze. The hospital staff had been so kind to him before, but now the looks are different, guarded, uncertain. He feels the weight of suspicion pressing against him like an invisible force. Trey leans against the cold wall, his fists clenched at his sides. He wants to burst back into the room and demand answers, but what good would it do? They had already made up their minds. The security guard stands nearby, watching him closely. Trey exhales, trying to steady his breathing. He needs to think, to figure out what's going on. Inside the hospital room, the nurse glances between the father and daughter. She clears her throat, hesitating before speaking again. Sir, has she ever mentioned anything like this before? The father finally looks up, his expression unreadable. He runs a hand through his disheveled hair, glancing at his daughter, who is now curled up beneath the hospital blankets. No, he says after a long pause. Never. But his voice lacks conviction, Do you think the girl is mistaking Trey for someone else? Let's discuss. Later that night, security footage is reviewed. The room is silent as the grainy video plays, and what they find changes everything. A shadowy figure is seen sneaking into the girl's home days before the crash. The timestamp confirms it. This was before Trey had ever been near her. The footage shows the figure lurking outside a window, then slipping inside undetected. The girl's terrified screams are silent in the footage, but her frantic movements as she's dragged out of the house say it all. Trey was nowhere near the scene. The officers exchange glances, tension thick in the air. The girl's father watches the screen, his face pale as realization sinks in. He had been so sure, so convinced that Trey was the one responsible. But the truth was staring him in the face now, undeniable. One of the detectives clears his throat. This changes everything. We need to act fast. The police are called, and an urgent investigation begins. Officers are dispatched immediately to track down the suspect. A report is filed, descriptions given, and within hours, the case takes a sharp turn. Finally, the girl's father is forced to face the truth. His daughter had been kidnapped before the accident. Trey wasn't the villain. He was the only one who saved her. As the officers gather more details, the father sits in stunned silence. He had accused the wrong person, thrown blame at the boy who had risked his own life to save his daughter. The weight of his mistake is suffocating. He looks down at his trembling hands, regret settling deep in his chest. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, Trey sits alone, staring at the pavement. He doesn't know what's happening inside, doesn't know that the truth is finally unraveling. All he knows is that he was treated like a criminal for something he didn't do. The hospital doors open, and a nurse steps out. She hesitates before approaching Trey, her expression softer now. "You should come back inside," she says gently. Trey looks up, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "Why?" She hesitates, then speaks the words he never expected to hear. "Because they owe you an apology. How do you think the father should apologize? Let's discuss." The real kidnapper is caught, and Trey's name is cleared. The truth, once buried under fear and doubt, is now undeniable. The police apprehend the suspect after an intense investigation, uncovering evidence that confirms Trey had nothing to do with the crime. News spreads quickly, and the weight of wrongful suspicion is finally lifted from his shoulders. The girl's father, full of regret, personally approaches Trey outside the hospital. His face is lined with guilt, his voice heavy with sincerity. "I was wrong about you," he says, his eyes filled with remorse. "I let my fear cloud my judgment. I accused you without knowing the truth." Trey looks at him for a long moment, unsure of how to respond. The anger, the frustration, it all sits inside him, a storm waiting to break. But he knows that holding on to it will only cause more pain. He exhales slowly and nods. The girl, still shaken but beginning to understand, finally meets Trey's eyes. "I'm sorry. I was just scared," she whispers, her voice small but genuine. Trey studies her, seeing not just the girl who had screamed at the sight of him, but someone who had gone through her own trauma. He knows that fear can cloud the truth, that memories can be twisted by emotions. He doesn't need to hear more. "I forgive you," he says simply. Despite the pain, he knows he did the right thing. And that's all that matters. The hospital staff, who had once looked at him with suspicion, now treat him with kindness. Some nod in respect as he walks through the halls. The doctors who had once doubted him now recognize the truth. The nurses who had ushered him out in fear now welcome him with understanding. The news of Trey's innocence spreads beyond the hospital. Reporters cover the story, and people across the city begin discussing the importance of not rushing to judgment. The community, once quick to believe the worst, now sees Trey for who he truly is, a hero. As Trey walks away from the hospital that evening, he doesn't feel like the same boy who had arrived there days ago. He is stronger now, not just because he survived being doubted, but because he chose to rise above it. He walks past the city lights, his mind quiet. He has learned something valuable, not just about himself, but about the world. The truth always finds a way to come out, even if it takes time. And sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with fists or words, but with patience, integrity, and the will to keep going. What's the biggest lesson from Trey's journey? Let's talk in the comments. A tense courtroom in Washington, D.C., where arrogance meets intelligence in the most unexpected way. Ethan Walker stood tall before Judge Morton, his shoulders squared, his face calm. The weight of the courtroom's gaze bore down on him, a silent but oppressive force. The scent of polished wood and old books filled the air, blending with the muted whispers from the prosecution's table. He could hear them snickering, their laughter like distant echoes in the vast chamber. The judge leaned back in his chair, his gavel tapping rhythmically against the polished surface of his bench. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth as he peered down at Ethan, his voice laced with condescension. "Do you even have a brain in that empty head of yours? Or is it just empty space, dumb boy?" A ripple of laughter spread through the courtroom. The prosecution's lead attorney, a man with salt and pepper hair and an expensive suit, chuckled under his breath. Jurors exchanged glances, some smirking, others hiding their amusement behind their hands. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between Ethan and the judge. Ethan did not move. He did not wince. He did not even blink. He just waited. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, as if the entire room had stopped breathing. A moment passed, then another. Ethan's lips parted, his voice smooth, unwavering. "Your Honor, the measure of intelligence is not in the words of the powerful, but in the resilience of the unheard." The room stilled. The sneers faded, replaced by a quiet murmur of curiosity. The judge's smirk faltered. Ethan's voice carried, firm yet controlled. "You sit on that bench, cloaked in authority, believing your gavel gives you the right to belittle me. But tell me, Judge Morton, what does it say about a man who derives satisfaction from humiliating a child?" A sharp inhale from someone in the jury box. A shifting of weight from the prosecution's table. Judge Morton's fingers twitched around his gavel. "Watch yourself, son," he warned, but the bite in his tone lacked its usual venom. Ethan took a step forward. "I have been watching, Your Honor, watching how power is wielded in this room, how truth is twisted by those who think their voices matter more than mine. But let me make one thing clear. Intelligence is not defined by the color of my skin or the assumptions you make about my worth." The room was frozen in rapt attention. Ethan's gaze never wavered. "I will not be your spectacle, nor will I be your victim. You asked if I have a brain in my head." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I do, and today you will remember it." A stunned silence followed. The prosecution's laughter had vanished, their expressions replaced with something closer to unease. The jury members sat up straighter, their previous amusement erased. Even the court stenographer had stopped typing, eyes wide. Judge Morton swallowed, his throat bobbing. For the first time since Ethan had entered the courtroom, the power dynamics had shifted. Ethan Walker had not just spoken. He had commanded the room. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Have you ever been underestimated only to prove people wrong? Share your story. 3 weeks earlier, Ethan Walker was just another quiet kid, a boy who found comfort in the predictability of numbers, the logic of puzzles, and the complexity of codes. His room was a sanctuary of scattered equations, half-solved ciphers, and books on quantum mechanics. He spoke little, but his mind never stopped moving. To the world, he was invisible. To himself, he was unstoppable. His world shifted the moment he stumbled upon the case of Daniel Grayson, a man sentenced to life for a crime he did not commit. Ethan had not been looking for it. Just another late night spent browsing court records, testing his ability to crack encrypted files. But something in the details of Grayson's case caught his attention. A minor inconsistency. A piece of evidence that did not align with the official reports. At first, it was curiosity. Then it became an obsession. He dove deep, pulling files, cross-referencing testimonies, reconstructing timelines. The deeper he went, the clearer it became. Evidence had been tampered with. The justice system had failed. A man sat in a prison cell, his future erased by a lie. Ethan's hands shook as he stared at the screen, the undeniable proof staring back at him. He had uncovered something big, something dangerous. Determined, he tried to share his findings. He sent emails to law firms, presented his analysis to legal offices, even approached journalists. No one listened. Who would believe a kid? He was dismissed before he could finish his sentences, waved off as a bored teenager chasing conspiracy theories. Doors were closed before he could knock. He had the truth in his hands, yet no one cared enough to see it. But Ethan was not built to give up. He sharpened his research, honed his arguments, found ways to make his proof undeniable. He rehearsed what he would say if given a chance. Every rejection only fueled his determination. The world underestimated him, but that was their first mistake. Every night, he went back to the files. He read court transcripts until his eyes blurred, replayed the testimonies in his head like a broken record. He traced the evidence back to its source, over and over again, until he could recall every inconsistency without even looking. He was not just searching for proof. He was becoming part of the case itself. When he was not studying the files, he was practicing his words. He stood in front of his mirror, delivering arguments to his reflection, fine-tuning every sentence until it was undeniable. He analyzed courtroom speeches, watching how the best lawyers commanded attention. He learned how to dismantle false narratives, how to ask the right questions, how to make people listen. If no one would believe him now, he would make them believe him later. The rejection did not wear him down. It built him up. It made him sharper, stronger, more determined. He had uncovered a lie buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and indifference, and if no one else would expose the truth, he would do it himself. Ethan Walker was not just another quiet kid. He was a genius. Would you fight for justice, even if no one took you seriously? Let's talk. Ethan Walker refused to give up. He had spent weeks trying to expose the truth, and every door he knocked on had been slammed in his face. But if they would not listen, he would make them listen. He needed undeniable proof, something they could not ignore. Then he found it. Buried deep within the outdated court security system, hidden behind layers of weak encryption, was the truth he had been searching for. The evidence files were supposed to be sealed, locked away where no one could access them. But Ethan knew the system had flaws no one had bothered to fix. With careful precision, he bypassed the outdated firewalls, navigating through the layers of data like a surgeon with a scalpel. What he discovered was shocking. Manipulated timestamps, deleted footage, falsified reports. Someone had gone to great lengths to cover up the truth. The evidence that could have exonerated Daniel Grayson had been tampered with, erased from official records as if it had never existed. But Ethan had found it. He had proof that the system was corrupt, that an innocent man had been condemned because someone had wanted him to disappear. But exposing the truth came at a cost. Before he could present his findings, he was caught. The system flagged his access, triggering an alert. By the time he realized what had happened, it was too late. Authorities stormed his home, seizing his computer, his notes, everything. They did not ask questions. They did not care about the evidence he had uncovered. All they saw was a teenager who had hacked into a government system. They did not see a whistleblower. They saw a criminal. Ethan was arrested, handcuffed, dragged through the same halls where he had hoped to seek justice. His name was smeared in the media, labeled a hacker, a reckless kid who had broken the law. No one cared that he had been right. No one wanted to hear what he had found. Now he stood in front of the judge. But he was not here as a witness. He was not here to present the truth. He was on trial, not for committing a crime, but for exposing one. The courtroom was silent. The prosecution painted him as a reckless teenager who had endangered national security. They ignored the evidence he had uncovered. They ignored the corruption he had exposed. All that mattered was that he had broken into the system. Ethan remained calm. He had always known this was a risk, but he also knew something else. He was not afraid. He had been underestimated before. They had called him a child. They had dismissed his words. But now, with the weight of truth behind him, he would not be silenced. He met the judge's gaze and spoke. "Do you think the system tries to silence the truth? Drop your thoughts below." Judge Morton leaned forward, his smirk unwavering. "You really think you're smarter than the entire justice system?" Ethan Walker did not flinch. His posture remained steady, his voice calm. "No, Your Honor, I just think I'm smarter than the people who tried to cover this up." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The sound of shuffling papers and hushed whispers filled the space. Even the prosecution exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence momentarily shaken. Ethan continued, his voice unwavering. "If you check Exhibit B, page 42, you'll see the security footage was altered. The original timestamp exists. I restored it." More murmurs. The defense attorney, who had been skeptical of Ethan's claims, suddenly flipped through the documents in front of him. His fingers trembled slightly as his eyes scanned the evidence. Then he stopped. His jaw tightened. Judge Morton's smirk faltered. "If you're lying, this will be perjury," he warned, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. "Then check the footage yourself." The courtroom was silent. Every eye was on the judge as he hesitated for the briefest moment before nodding toward the bailiff. Within minutes, a technician was called in to examine the footage. The minutes felt like hours as the file was retrieved, played, analyzed. Then the confirmation came. The footage had, in fact, been altered. Ethan had restored the original timestamp, revealing a truth that had been buried beneath layers of deception. A sharp intake of breath echoed from the prosecution's table. The lead attorney, who had been confident in his case, now looked visibly shaken. The defense attorney once doubtful of Ethan's claims, straightened in his seat, realization dawning on his face. Judge Morton's expression darkened. The weight of the revelation was evident in his tightened grip on the gavel. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "How did you gain access to this information?" he asked, though the tone of his voice had shifted. It was no longer dripping with arrogance. It was cautious now, measured. Ethan's voice remained steady. "The truth was always there, Your Honor. It just needed someone willing to find it." The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan could feel the shift in the air, the sudden acknowledgement that he was no longer just a kid standing before the court. He was a force they had not anticipated. The prosecution scrambled to recover, but the cracks in their case were widening. The jury members exchanged glances, some of them nodding, others watching Ethan with newfound respect. The judge, now devoid of his earlier smirk, rapped his gavel once, calling for order. "We will reconvene after a full review of this evidence," he announced. Ethan exhaled slowly as the courtroom erupted in murmurs. He had not just presented a case, he had turned the entire trial on its head. "What would you do if you were in Ethan's position? Let's discuss." A hush fell over the courtroom as the footage played. Every eye was locked onto the screen, every breath held. Frame by frame, the truth unfolded. Everything Ethan Walker had said was true. The footage had been altered. The timestamps had been manipulated. The evidence against Daniel Grayson had been fabricated. It was undeniable now. Then the room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, the low hum of disbelief spreading like wildfire. The jury members exchanged glances, some leaning forward, others whispering among themselves. The defense attorney ran a hand through his hair, a stunned expression on his face. Across the aisle, the prosecution's confidence crumbled before the entire courtroom. Their lead attorney flipped through the documents on his desk, scrambling for something, anything, to refute what had just been exposed. Judge Morton shifted uncomfortably. His earlier arrogance, the smug amusement he had worn like a shield, was gone. He had mocked a boy who had just unraveled a major injustice before his very eyes. He cleared his throat as if trying to regain his authority, but the damage had been done. The power in the room had shifted, and everyone knew it. The prosecution's panic deepened as more inconsistencies surfaced. Ethan had not just uncovered one mistake. His findings had blown open a door to something much larger. The judge turned to the prosecution. "Do you have an explanation for this?" Silence. The lead attorney clenched his jaw, rifling through his notes. There was nothing they could say, nothing they could do to undo what had just happened. The implications rippled through the courtroom like an earthquake. What had started as a single case, one wrongful conviction, was now revealing itself as something much bigger. A network of lies. A conspiracy stretching beyond a single prosecutor or detective. Ethan sat still, watching, as the case he had fought so hard to expose collapsed under its own corruption. His mind raced, connecting the dots faster than anyone else in the room. He had found more than just tampered evidence. He had stumbled upon something that reached far beyond Daniel Grayson. The trail led to powerful people, corrupt officials. A senator whose name now appeared in the altered files, tied to cases that should have never gone to trial. It was bigger than Ethan had imagined. The courtroom was no longer just focused on Daniel Grayson's case. It was focused on a system that had been rigged for far too long. And now, with the weight of truth pressing down on it, cracks were beginning to form. Judge Morton, now visibly uncomfortable, sighed heavily. This court is adjourned until a full investigation is conducted." The sound of the gavel striking echoed through the room, but it did little to mask the realization that had settled over everyone present. Ethan had done more than prove a man's innocence. He had exposed a conspiracy. Do you believe the justice system protects the powerful? Let's talk. Ethan Walker's revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom, but the aftershocks reached far beyond those walls. What he had uncovered was not just one case of corruption. It was an entire network of deception, and powerful people were watching. Hours after the court adjourned, Ethan found himself walking alone, the adrenaline of the day still coursing through him. The victory was fresh, but something in the air felt different, tense. Office. That was when he noticed them. Men in dark suits. They appeared from the shadows of a quiet alleyway, their footsteps controlled, their presence deliberate. One of them, tall and expressionless, stepped forward. "You need to stop asking questions, kid." Ethan's heartbeat quickened, but he stood his ground. Or what? The man did not answer. Instead, he simply stared, as if waiting for Ethan to understand the weight of his own defiance. They had underestimated him in the courtroom. Now they were trying intimidation. But Ethan had already learned the most important lesson. Fear is a tool used to silence truth. He refused to back down. Instead, he turned to the media. With the help of Carter, a federal agent who had been following the trial closely, Ethan compiled every piece of evidence he had uncovered. The files, the footage, the names. It was all there, meticulously organized and ready to be exposed. The world needed to see what he had found. He leaked the documents. Within hours, the headlines exploded. News outlets ran the story nonstop. Social media ignited with outrage. The justice system had been caught protecting its own, shielding corruption under layers of bureaucracy. But now, the truth was out, and there was no containing it. The fallout was immediate. The senator implicated in the conspiracy was arrested, dragged from his office as cameras captured every moment. Protests erupted outside government buildings, demanding accountability. Investigations were launched into multiple wrongful convictions, exposing the full extent of the corruption Ethan had uncovered. And then there was Judge Morton. The same man who had once mocked Ethan now stood before the cameras, issuing a public apology. He had played his role in the system, dismissing voices that should have been heard. And now, with the weight of undeniable evidence against him, he had no choice but to acknowledge his failure. Ethan watched it all unfold, standing on the sidelines of the storm he had unleashed. He was no longer just the quiet kid who had been ignored, underestimated, or mocked. He was the boy who had taken on the system, and won. Do you think exposing corruption is worth the risk? Let's talk about it. Location. A dimly lit alleyway in downtown Philadelphia, where shadows hide secrets and danger lurks in the corners. A heroic rescue takes a chilling turn when a little girl's words reveal an even bigger nightmare. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Jaden Walker never expected that his late-night shortcut home would change everything. At just 12 years old, he knew the streets well. He had grown up navigating them, learning which corners to avoid, which alleys to ignore. But that night, something was different. The air felt colder. The silence felt heavier. As he walked past a dark alley, a sound stopped him in his tracks. Muffled sobs. His instincts told him to run, to keep walking and pretend he had not heard anything. But something inside him, something stronger than fear, made him stop. Slowly, cautiously, He peered into the darkness. That was when he saw her. A little girl, no older than 6, curled up against the brick wall. Her arms were tied, her face streaked with tears, her wide eyes filled with terror. Jaden's breath caught in his throat. His pulse pounded in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to run and get help. But there was no time for that. Before he could think, he rushed forward. "It's okay," he whispered, kneeling beside her. His fingers worked quickly, untying the ropes around her wrists. "I got you." The little girl trembled, her small hands gripping his sleeve. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something but could not find the words. Then finally, she spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the 4 words sent a chill down Jaden's spine. "Help! They got my brother!" His hands froze for just a second, the weight of her words sinking in. His eyes darted around the alley, searching for any sign of movement. Whoever had taken her brother could still be close. Jaden swallowed hard, his mind racing. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay, that they would find her brother, but he knew words were not enough. Action was what mattered now. He took a deep breath and pulled her to her feet. "Can you walk?" She nodded weakly, though her legs wobbled beneath her. He steadied her, glancing over his shoulder once more. The alley stretched further into darkness, and an uneasy feeling settled in his stomach. There were too many places someone could hide, too many ways this could go wrong. But he could not leave, not now. "Which way did they go?" he asked, his voice low. She hesitated before pointing deeper into the alley. Jaden clenched his fists. Every part of him wanted to run in the opposite direction and get help. But what if there was no time? What if her brother was still close, still waiting to be saved? His mind warred between fear and determination. He knew the risks, knew that stepping further into the shadows could be dangerous. But he also knew one thing for certain. He could not just walk away. He looked back at the girl, his decision made. "Stay close," he told her. "We're going to find him." What would you do if you were in Jaden's position? "Let's discuss." Jaden frantically untied the little girl, his hands shaking as he worked. His heart pounded against his ribs, the urgency of the moment crashing down on him. He could hear her ragged breathing, see the terror in her eyes. She was no older than 6, her small face streaked with dirt and tears. Her wrists bore red marks where the ropes had been too tight. "Who took your brother?" Jaden whispered, his voice urgent but careful. Her lower lip quivered. "The men," she hiccuped. "They said he's next if I scream." Jaden swallowed hard, his grip tightening around her small hands. His mind raced. Whoever had taken her brother was still nearby. They could come back at any moment. "We have to go, now." His voice was firm, leaving no room for hesitation. She nodded, her tiny fingers latching onto his wrist as he helped her to her feet. He peered out of the alley, scanning the street. It was late, the sidewalks mostly empty, the flickering streetlights casting eerie shadows. If they could just make it to the main road, maybe someone would help them. Just as they stepped forward, a noise behind them sent a jolt of fear through Jaden's spine. Footsteps, slow, purposeful. Then a voice, deep, rough, dripping with menace. "Where do you think you're going?" Jaden's stomach dropped. His fingers instinctively tightened around the girl's hand. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of a figure emerging from the shadows. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, his silhouette stretching against the dim alley light. Jaden's mind screamed at him to move. The little girl whimpered, pressing closer to his side. He could feel her trembling, her fingers clutching at his sleeve. The man took another step forward, his heavy boots scraping against the pavement. Every instinct told Jaden to run, but his feet felt frozen in place. His breath quickened. He glanced toward the open street, calculating the distance. If he ran now, could they make it? Would the man catch them before they even reached the sidewalk? The little girl tugged at his hand. Jaden! He had to decide. Now his pulse thundered in his ears as he shifted his weight, bracing himself. If he ran, he had to be fast, faster than he had ever been. If he fought, he had to be smart, smarter than the man who loomed over them. The man chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "You really think you can just walk away?" Jaden's muscles tensed. He had no idea what this man was capable of, but he knew one thing. He could not let him take the girl. He would not let another child disappear into the darkness. His grip on her hand tightened as he made his choice. Would you run or fight? "Let's talk." Jaden tightened his grip on the girl's hand. "Come on," he shouted, bolting toward the street. Behind them, heavy boots slammed against the pavement. The men were giving chase. Jaden's breath came in sharp bursts as they wove through the streets, dodging past honking cars and startled pedestrians. His legs burned, but he did not stop. He could not stop. The girl struggled to keep up, her small feet stumbling as they ran, but she did not let go of his hand. "Help! They have my brother!" she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. People turned to stare. Some paused, confused, but no one moved to help. No one wanted to get involved. Jaden's mind raced. He scanned the streets looking for something, anything that could save them. Then he saw it. A police car, parked at a gas station just ahead. "We're almost there," he gasped, pushing himself harder. His legs felt like they would give out, but he could not slow down. Just as they reached the lot, a rough hand grabbed the girl's hoodie and yanked her back. She let out a terrified cry. Jaden reacted instinctively. His eyes darted to a metal trash can beside him. Without thinking, he swung it with all his strength. "Let her go!" The impact sent the man stumbling back. The girl wrenched free, her breath coming in panicked gasps. Jaden grabbed her hand again, and they sprinted toward the officers. The men behind them recovered quickly. Heavy footsteps thundered against the pavement as they surged forward, closing the gap. Jaden could hear their breathing, their determination. They were not about to let the kids escape so easily. The gas station's bright lights flickered overhead as they reached the parking lot. Jaden's chest heaved with each breath, his grip tightening around the girl's trembling fingers. The officers near the squad car turned, their faces shifting from casual to alert in an instant. Jaden didn't stop. He didn't look back. "Help! Please!" he gasped as he reached the first officer. The words tumbled out of him between breaths. "They were chasing us. They took her brother." The girl clung to Jaden, her face buried against his arm. She was shaking, unable to speak. The officers exchanged glances, their eyes scanning the lot. One of them, a tall man with a stern expression, crouched down to meet Jaden's gaze. Breathless, Jaden and the girl reached the officers. "She was kidnapped." "And they have her brother," he blurted out, his voice shaking. The officers exchanged glances, their skepticism evident. One of them, a stocky man with graying hair, folded his arms. "Slow down, kid. What are you talking about?" The girl sobbed, her small hands clutching Jaden's sleeve. "They said they'd take us both," she choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. The skepticism vanished. The officers snapped to attention. "Where? Who took him?" the tall officer demanded, already reaching for his radio. Jaden spun around, pointing toward the alley where they had come from. But the men were gone. The once shadowed path now stood empty, only the distant hum of the city breaking the silence. A tense moment passed. The officers scanned the area, their hands hovering near their holsters. Then, the radio crackled to life. All units, possible child abduction in progress. Suspects may be armed. Proceed with caution. Jaden felt his heart hammering against his ribs. The weight of the night pressed down on him, exhaustion clawing at his limbs. He glanced at the girl who still trembled beside him. Her face was pale, her tear-streaked cheeks glistening under the harsh gas station lights. The officer who had spoken first crouched in front of them. "Kid, you need to tell us everything. Start from the beginning. What exactly happened?" Jaden gulped in air, his mind replaying every terrifying moment. "I was walking home, and I heard her crying. She was tied up in the alley, and she said the men took her brother. She said if she screamed, they'd take her too. I untied her, and we ran. They chased us. They almost caught us. But we got here." The officer nodded, processing every word. His gaze flicked toward his partner. "We need to check that alley, now." One officer turned toward his radio again. "Dispatch, we need backup near the gas station on 5th. Send units to search the area. We have a child abduction case unfolding." Jaden and the girl remained silent as the officers moved with urgency. The fear in Jaden's chest did not ease. The men had disappeared too easily. Had they gone into hiding? Were they watching them even now? The tall officer gave them a reassuring nod. "You both are safe now. Stay here. We're going to find him." Jaden wasn't sure he could believe that. The girl's brother was still missing. The men had escaped into the night. And time was slipping away. "Have you ever been ignored when telling the truth?" "Let's discuss." Jaden insisted on going with the police. "I heard a van. They were going east," he said, his voice urgent. The officers hesitated for only a second before one of them nodded. "Get in," he said, opening the back door of the squad car. The girl sat beside Jaden, still shaking. Her small fingers clutched his sleeve as if afraid to let go. "They said my brother was next," she whispered. "Tell us everything you remember," the officer in the front seat said as he turned the key. The engine roared to life, and the sirens blared as they sped off. "A black SUV," the girl said. "Tinted windows, 2 men. One had a scar on his cheek. The other smelled like cigarettes." The officer relayed the information over the radio. "Be advised, we are searching for a black SUV, likely moving east. Suspects are 2 males, possible child inside." Jaden stared out the window as the city lights blurred past them. His hands clenched into fists. He had done everything he could, but it was not over yet. Then the radio crackled. "Suspect vehicle spotted on EI-95 moving fast." Jaden's breath caught. "Please, find him," he murmured. The police car accelerated, weaving through traffic. Jaden could feel the tension thick in the air. Every second mattered. Every passing moment felt too long. Minutes later, they reached the highway. Red and blue lights flashed ahead. A roadblock had been set up. Officers had their guns drawn, positioned behind their vehicles. The black SUV screeched to a halt, tires smoking against the pavement. "Hands up! Step out of the vehicle!" An officer bellowed through a megaphone. A long, agonizing pause followed. Then the car door flew open. A small boy stumbled out, his face streaked with tears. The girl gasped, "Aiden!" She bolted from the police car, running straight toward her brother. Jaden followed, his heart pounding. One of the officers caught the girl just before she reached the vehicle. "Wait! We need to secure the area." But Aiden broke free, running toward her, his sobs mixing with hers. The officers quickly restrained the 2 men inside the SUV. One of them cursed under his breath as he was shoved against the hood of a police cruiser. The other glared silently, His jaw clenched. Jaden barely noticed. His eyes were on Aiden and his sister, their small arms wrapped around each other, clinging as if they would never let go. One of the officers approached, placing a reassuring hand on Jaden's shoulder. "You did good, kid. You saved them." Jaden exhaled, his body sagging from exhaustion. He had never wanted to be a hero. He had just wanted to help. Now, looking at Aiden and his sister, he knew he had done the right thing. The nightmare was over. Do you believe in miracles? Let's talk about it. The kidnappers were taken into custody, their hands secured behind their backs as officers led them away. What had started as a terrifying chase had now led to something even bigger, an organized trafficking ring exposed. The officers worked quickly, searching the black SUV and securing evidence that would ensure the men never walked free again. Jaden and the little girl stood side by side, watching, as the officers placed the men into the back of a patrol car. Relief washed over them, but the weight of the night still hung heavy in the air. "They can't hurt anyone else now," Jaden said, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl looked up at him, her eyes still wide with lingering fear. She gave a small nod, gripping her brother's hand tightly. Aiden had stopped crying, but he clung to his sister as if he feared she might disappear again. The scene around them was chaotic. Flashing lights, radios crackling, voices giving orders. Officers moved with urgency, speaking into their radios, documenting the case. The gravity of what had been uncovered was still sinking in. This was not just a single abduction. It was something far worse. Hours later, after statements had been taken, and the children were reunited with their family, the mayor arrived on the scene. News crews gathered, cameras flashing as he stepped forward. He shook hands with the officers, then turned to Jaden. "Because of you, 2 lives were saved," the mayor said, his voice filled with gratitude. Jaden shuffled his feet, unsure how to respond. He had not done this for recognition. He had only done what felt right. The girl's parents, with tears in their eyes, stepped forward. They embraced Jaden, their emotions overwhelming them. "You are our angel," the mother whispered, her voice breaking. "We will never forget what you did." Jaden stood frozen for a moment before nodding. He had never considered himself a hero, but tonight he had made a difference. What do you think Jaden deserves for his bravery? Let's discuss. Jaden, once just a boy walking home, was now a hero. His courage had not only saved the little girl, but had also led to the rescue of her brother. What started as an ordinary night had transformed into a moment that would be remembered forever.